Hi, it's Gary, and thanks for joining me in this video, which is personally one of the most meaningful presentations that I've ever done. It's about my approach to controlling sound. And it's part strategy session, it's analysis, and I hope it's an encouragement to those of you who are developing luthiers. And for those of you who aren't guitar builders, I think it'll be pretty interesting for you to see what preoccupies the minds of most luthiers. I call it the inner game of lutherie because controlling the sound is really the next big frontier after you learn how to do the construction part, the actual woodwork of putting a box together. And this part about controlling sound is what fires the imagination, the curiosity, and the creativity of most builders. This video, which is conceptual in nature, will set up the next several videos that you'll see. And I hope it serves as a conceptual framework upon which you can build your own experiences, ideas, and building methods. And I hope in the process it will begin to take away the mystical nature of guitar building. By mystical, I don't mean that it will take the romance and fun out of guitar building. I don't think that lutherie will ever become mechanical and cold because it's just too much fun. And these little wondrous boxes of strings that make beautiful sounds just have so much challenge of complexity and discovery that it will never become cold. So what follows next is my conceptual roadmap of how I control sound through structure. And I know that guitars are so complex, I will never know it all. I will never know all the secrets within a resonating body like a guitar. But I do know that through experience that there are certain things that influence the sound more so than others. And I know that if I capitalize on those and do those things well, and if I'm consistent in my methods, I have a really reasonable chance of reproducing a guitar's sound from one guitar to the next, or even moving the sound how I want. So let's begin with the chalk talk now, and let me describe to you what this inner game really is about. Imagine that the space within this funnel represents all the possible ways we could build a guitar, and that the funnel's borders are the constraints set by the laws of physics. Yeah, I know I said physics, but don't worry, you don't need to know physics. Next, imagine that this marble marks the path through every decision and manipulation we make during the construction process. As we go through the process of establishing more structure, we steer the possible sound outcomes. When the marble exits, it will land somewhere in this red sound zone with a set of sound characteristics which are governed by the structural changes we made. And for example, if we made another guitar and made some different choices during construction, the guitar's sound could end up over here. And for simplicity, a couple sound characteristics could be bright on the left or dark to the right. But in reality, there are probably on the order of 10 to 100 possible sound attributes that highly skilled players could name. And let's face it, those characteristics aren't concrete because what players and audiences perceive is some fascinating and even bewildering amalgamation of acoustics and psychology. Imagine now a slightly more realistic situation with two types of comparisons in play: bright versus dark and loud versus quiet. The sound characteristics of this particular guitar is that it's bright and has slightly above average loudness. Now you can think of how individual guitars have combinations of different characteristics. And you can think of guitars you've played and have enjoyed, and I think you'll understand the complexity of traits that different guitars have. Some other traits might be good sustain, large color palette, and evenness of notes across the range. The interesting thing is that even guitars that land close to one another, in other words, they sound similar to one another, they can often easily be distinguished by highly skilled and experienced players. Sometimes the difference can be one note that is weaker in one guitar And really good instruments are often judged by the number of their weaknesses rather than the number of their strengths. And we know in reality there's no such thing as a perfect guitar. That might drive some people crazy, but I and many luthiers get hooked on the challenge of trying to build one. Getting back to this original idea of different construction paths, the key thing to recognize is that some of the things that we do during construction have more influence on the sound than others. And the key is to learn through experience or through others what these rules are. And in my experience, I've found that there's a hierarchy of influences. So let's talk about these hierarchies now. At the top of the hierarchy is the guitar's design. I'm not talking about just bracing pattern, which is just one of the many design elements, but for non-luthiers, bracing is often the only thing that can be easily seen. That is, if you look inside. But as we'll see shortly and in upcoming videos, bracing is only one of many important factors that influences sound. The type of design that I'm talking about is more of a complete system, such as the top assembly plus the infrastructure that supports it. So think in terms of style, such as a steel string acoustic that has a pretty sturdy construction to withstand the high tension of the strings, or a classical that is lightly built because it has lower tension strings. And then even within these styles, you can further divide, such as in classical, you would have maybe a traditional Taurus style guitar, which would be very different in sound than an Australian lattice brace guitar. And no matter who builds these styles of guitar, generally the sound within a certain style will sound very similar. That's because the overriding factor is the design. The point is, depending on what design you're currently using, your marble will start in a different place at the top of the funnel and will be predisposed towards a certain sound, such as I build double-top soundboards on light but rigid sides, which have a very different starting point from, say, Australian-style lattice brace guitars with heavy and rigid back and sides, which might start over here. These different designs will predispose each towards a slightly different sound path. Maybe you use a more traditional design which will start in yet a different position and will probably sound different compared to either of these two when we finish them. Next on the order of hierarchy is material selection, predominantly the top wood. In my opinion, selection of wood is less about spruce versus cedar, but more about the material properties such as stiffness and weight, which I alluded to in episode 1. We'll talk in detail about this in episode 6. Perhaps you can think of additional levels of hierarchy, but I think the last level is execution, the actual bench work we do, which is not only the last step in the whole building process, but I think represents over 95% of the work we do. This realm is huge because there are so many steps. I once counted about 200 steps in my own guitars. And there are so many choices to make about techniques and the order in which you do the steps. Yes, order matters a lot because doing a certain step at a given time can eliminate your options, and that can be problematic if you need to change course. Finally, there's the whole question of whether or not you're skilled in each technical step. Because if you're not, that can really mess up your design intent or consistency if you don't have the skills to execute. You could argue that execution has a higher level of influence over material selection, but I just feel that material properties of the wood have an ever-present, overarching effect on everything that we do. And execution is also the last step in construction, so I put it there at the end of the funnel. So revisiting this mental exercise, I submit to you that this is the inner game of Lutherie, and that the reason why I started with this video ahead of jumping right into techniques, it's because I know that for developing luthiers or even someone like me who's done it for a while, it can feel daunting trying to control sound, as if we are in an endless universe of possibilities searching for a needle in a haystack. But by reminding ourselves that there are boundaries set by acoustic principles and that there is cause and effect in play, we will feel less lost, more likely to ask the right questions, and be more open to the answers when they present themselves. Now let me dive deeper into some ideas about material selection and execution. And as I mentioned in episode 1, The resonances in vibrating bodies like guitars are heavily influenced by stiffness and weight, and so naturally a lot of guitar building is about modulating stiffness and weight, building it up, taking it down in order to optimize the sound. So let's start talking about some specifics now. In material selection, we can measure and choose material based on density. By doing that, we can decide on both stiffness and weight. Then when we start the execution stage, the actual construction, when we thin the top, stiffness goes down, weight goes down. When we add doming to the top, we add stiffness, but not weight. And when we add bracing, we add stiffness, but not much weight compared to the weight of the top plate. And then finally, when we carve the braces, we decrease stiffness and decrease weight by a tiny bit. Now, here's the big question you've probably been asking yourself. How do stiffness and weight translate to sound? Well, the Rosetta Stone that explains the relationship of the physical structure to the guitar's sound is this. In general, a stiffer structure results in a brighter, more treble-oriented sound, whereas a heavier structure results in a darker, more bass-oriented sound. And conversely, something that's more flexible will be darker sounding, and something that's lighter will be brighter sounding. It's not the only thing, but my experience has been that this bright versus dark characteristic is a big parameter in guitars because it encompasses many issues about a guitar's perceived voice, such as overtone content and the relative volume of notes at different ranges of pitch. If you can get basic control over bright versus dark, then you can further nuance a guitar's voice through different design elements and altering the spatial distribution of stiffness and weight. We'll talk more about this in upcoming videos. Now, I hope you can see where we're heading with all of this, that we're not just grasping at something nebulous. And even if we don't understand all the complex acoustics that are going on in the guitar, if we keep detailed notes on our construction path, we have a good chance of reproducing the sound that we created, or if we intentionally deviate from that pathway, we can move the sound in a rational way. And the point is that we now have reference points. So let's move ahead, let's move forward, and on the next video we'll talk about material selection in more depth. So I hope to see you on that video.